Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're going to start our afternoon session of this ETHOS meeting. At 1 o'clock, we were scheduled to have members of the Alliance for Equal Justice community. It also says public input from the Alliance for Equal Justice community. Is there anybody here representing any of the members of the Alliance for Equal Justice community that would like to speak? Seeing a lot of hands. Anybody in the room? Nope. What we thought we might do as a kind of an audible is just continue with our general discussion about the bar and the 3 questions that were asked by the state Supreme Court to us as announced by Chief Justice Gonzalez way back at the beginning of this year. And what I thought we would do is just, we have some members on who I know they've been listening and paying attention and all that. And I thought it'd be nice if they had an opportunity to just share, if they care to, any thoughts, feelings, or concerns they have about the existing structure, the ideal structure, the fallback structure in case one of these cases that's kind of been sent back to the district courts and different federal circuits all of a sudden starts getting active again and we get concerned about it. Any thoughts, feelings, or concerns about any of those ideas? I think it was Chair Cherry. No, nobody wants to hazard a guess. Well, let me throw out a topic of discussion and see if that engenders anything. I've been looking around the country, and it seems to me like when you've got a huge state with lots of lawyers, all of a sudden there seems to be more of a breakup. For example, you look at New York, they don't have an integrated bar, and Illinois doesn't have an integrated bar. Now California doesn't have an integrated bar. Is there anybody who thinks that it's something that is just simply a matter of size, and at some point you're going to have so many lawyers with so many diverse views in a state that it's very, very hard to try and corral them into sort of a single unified speak with one voice type body? Does anybody think that? And we're not there yet. Obviously, California has what, 400,000 lawyers? We got what, 40? We're 10% of what they have.
I don't believe it's a size issue. It's a history issue.
We've got Practice of Law Board Sherry who'd like to say something.
Mr. President, wait a minute.
Oh, somebody else?
Yeah, no, just wait a minute. Could Governor-elect Fay say more about history issue?
Well, I used to be admitted in New York back when mastodons roamed the earth. And the New York bar has never had anything but regulatory functions from its inception. And there are, a number of voluntary bars in New York, like the Association of the Bar of the City of New York, which I also was a member of. But the New York State Bar is a function of the court system, and it is run out of what essentially are the circuit courts in the various districts in New York State.
Yeah, and I know that Minnesota's never had an integrated bar. That's one of the things I picked up from retired Judge Kevin Burke when he came out and spoke to us here last year at our retreat. Never had one. So yeah, it might just be a matter of history. Some states just haven't ever had that. I don't know about Illinois, but I know that they're a big bar that most people want to be part of in terms of a lobbying group is a voluntary bar. Well, that was my great idea for starting a discussion. Didn't seem to fly very far. Treasurer Peterson.
Or President
Oh,
Tolson.
I'm sorry. I skipped Michael Cherry. I meant to do Michael Cherry first.
President Tolson, I think you raise an interesting point, and it's one that in looking at unlawful practice of law and just some other issues, I do think that the geography of the state has an impact. And so it's not just that New York, California, and Florida and Texas, for example, may have more lawyers, but they also have this geographic diversity, which is completely different. When you, particularly New York State, I went to university in New York, lived in New York for a period of time, and there's New York City with a huge population, but then you get into upstate New York, and their needs in the legislature and from the judiciary are completely different. It's a completely different area. You see this in Florida, the difference between Gainesville and Miami, or Deerfield Beach, and then you get into Texas, East-West Texas versus, say, Austin. So I think geography is a factor, and I think it's a factor for Washington as well, because we do have to, well, we don't have as many lawyers. I think they are generally centered in Puget Sound. But so I think it is a factor in this discussion, and it's one to think about a bit, but they do things completely differently. And again, with UPL, one of the things that is completely surprising to me, and I'm looking at some cases, is that so here we're completely removed in Washington. The Practice of Law Board accumulates and collects complaints, but we refer them to agencies, where in Florida, it's the Florida Bar that actually prosecutes UPL cases. So, structure has impact on how things work. And the bars are uniquely different, not just in what we might call whether they're integrated or not integrated, but their history, their geography, the public they serve, they differ. There's not this great commonality, I think, across all of these. So that's all I wanted to say. I think you're right on that aspect. It has some impact on this.
Treasurer Peterson, sorry. Didn't have my
no, thank you, President Tolson. And I guess what I'm trying to figure out, and I know I raised the same question in the last ETHOS meeting and never got really an answer to it, but as a hypothetical, let's say Washington State Bar Association stays the overarching organization, but the regulatory admissions is mandatory, and everything else is quote unquote voluntary. And let's say the sections kind of remain, they all remain the same, right? They still remain WSBA sections, even though WSBA would then be voluntary. My question is, in that hypothetical, I mean, my inclination is to think that GR12 would still apply to those sections because they're still WSBA sections, even though that's a voluntary part of WSBA. And so, at least in my mind, trying to figure out if that makes a difference or not, we need to figure out for sure legally what that answer would be, and maybe we'd have to ask the Supreme Court for an opinion on that.
Thank you very much. Governor Williams-Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. President. And just to respond to that and kind of expand on where I was thinking there might be an answer to some of the issues is, again, a separate entity where if people wanted to engage specifically in political action, they would pay their $10 membership fee to a different entity. So though we could all be members of WSBA, we can also all choose to be members of the Downtown YMCA, or we can all choose to be members of Seattle Rotary No. 4. And they're entirely separate. So again, and maybe it's because I've been a member of on the board of trustees for the Bar Foundation since 2018 to 2019, that I've seen how that works and how the symbiotic relationship is functioning highly well, and but yet it's its own entire different structure with its different board, and so that's the thing is I don't believe there's any need to seek clarification from the court. It's if we as the WSBA say we are no longer going to be having conversations about supporting speech relating to things outside of GR 12.2 C3, and all of that would go to this other entity, and we've specifically limited ourselves to court rules and things that were directly related to the regulation of the practice of law, then that is where people would look. And again, the state legislature would know that it's a very tight-knit people. The lobbyists that work in Olympia have worked there for decades, and they work for different employers. The people that work with the WSBA right now are well known by the players down there. And if all of a sudden their paycheck came from a different entity other than WSBA, but call it the WSBA Legislative Action Group, when they're talking to the committees and the committee chairs and the staff that are helping guide policy, they would know that this is the entity that speaks on behalf of attorneys in Washington. Now, it's again different than the Prosecutors Association or the Washington Association of Justice, because they're large and strong enough to have their own lobbyists and their own political presence. But you have sections that are smaller and are mighty in their own right, but don't have the resources to have their own independent voice. And so that's where, again, I believe that we can have a potential solution that would be legal on paper, would separate the issues, just like on the Board of Governors, where we don't press Doug Ende on anything relating to the disciplinary things, because we're supposed to maintain that separation. And I think that could solve a lot of our problems, where GR 12.2 still exist, will still be there, but it would not be applied to an entity that's not under those rules.
We got more hands up. Treasurer Peterson, did you have something else you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, thank you, President Tolson. I agree with Governor Williams-Ruth. I mean, people can set up different entities, and in fact, we already have that with DRAW and the Washington Legal Foundation and the MBAs. But I guess my point being is, we can do that under the current structure. So I'm not sure why we would change the structure to do something that we can already do. I do agree with Governor Couch that you lose something there, right? I mean, if the legislators get something from, the WSBA diversity section, that's going to carry more weight. So, you lose something, but I guess my point being is, if that's what people want to do, we don't have to change the structure. We can just continue to allow people to do their own thing and say whatever they want to the legislature. Thank you.
You have a reply, Governor Williams-Ruth? And then we'll move on to Chief Disciplinary Counsel Doug Ende.
Thank you. If I may, Mr. President, and again, after just spent my first year as president or as chair of board legislative committee, that actually would be a change in our structure, because right now sections don't have independent speech. They are under the umbrella of the WSBA. Now, minority bar associations and Q Law Foundation and all other legal entities, the King County Bar Association, the Pierce County Bar Association, the Spokane lawyers, the Wenatchee Douglas, Chelan Douglas Estate Planning Council, all of those aren't under WSBA, and they could make their own things. But right now, if the World Peace Through Law section wants us to if they want to jump in and they want to advocate and have a strongly worded letter, think of it like an amicus brief that says that we should be absolutely doing even more to intervene in a foreign conflict, that would be impermissible under our rules. And because they are under the umbrella of the WSBA. Now, if there was this other organization where the members of World Peace Through Law section also had this other membership in this other political group, then they would be able to do whatever they want. And again, the people in power would know that if Sanjay Valekar became, sent them this letter and it was on a different letterhead, I don't think we're losing anything. I mean, when I was a young lawyer, there was a group called WISLA. WISLA doesn't exist anymore. It's because that was the Washington State Trial Lawyers Association. I've got lovely certificates with a WISLA logo. It's now called the Washington State Association of Justice. Did they lose any political capital when they all of a sudden started using a different name, even though it was the same? So I'm functionally saying that this would be a shell game. I mean, I'll admit to what I'm saying is create a legal entity that will allow people a safe harbor to openly and vociferously fight for the things they want. I mean, I am the liaison to the LGBTQ section, and they had their executive meeting this past week. And as you can likely imagine, feelings are really raw right now in the LGBTQ world. Really, really raw. And they look to what they can possibly do to take a stand, to stand up and speak, even if it doesn't have any importance, even if it's not to the Washington legislature, but being able to just do something. But our current rules don't allow for it. And so that's the thing is there may be other entities and people that have other avenues, but the LGBTQ section is really small. The last demographic study that was produced from the Bar Association showed that members of the LGBTQ plus population make up just about 1% of our membership. And that the only group of more or less represented were those of indigenous population. And so, that's who I'm trying to advocate for, is the voices of people that don't have a large footprint, that have answers elsewhere. But also, I don't want to have them send 65 individual letters. They should speak with a voice and have an avenue and a place where they can send that out without having to do a dance. And and that's the thing is our Office of General Counsel is the one that gets saddled with having to tell people, I'm sorry, this speaker that you want to have come in for this CLE is not compliant. This article that you want to run in Bar News can't run this way. This position you want to take on a piece of legislation is not permissible. All of these things have happened in the past, and I would love it where we never have to tell any section you can't do it, but you would just instead of coming from WSBA and instead of being signed by President Tollefson, it could be signed by the president of this other board that is the one, and they would have their own structure and their own rules and their own processes, and it might mirror exactly what the legislative process would be if it were here under a section. Who knows? I mean, again, this is not here to have I'm not here with 50 pages of a proposal with proposed bylaws and articles of incorporation. I'm trying to float the idea so people can have that safe harbor that we don't have right now.
Thank you, Governor Williams-Ruth. We have Chief Disciplinary Counsel ND, followed by Governor Stevens, followed by Governor-elect Ray.
Thank you, President Tollefson. I wanted to circle back to Treasurer Peterson's question about the hypothetical bifurcation if the regulatory functions go elsewhere and the Washington State Bar Association becomes a voluntary bar. Wouldn't GR 12 still restrict the Washington State Bar Association's activities? I hope, Treasurer Peterson, I'm tracking on your question. And I think it's important to recall how GR 12 came about. GR12 was, or what we now know as GR 12.2, was enacted in 1987, more than 50 years into the existence of the Washington State Bar Association. And it wasn't because everyone thought, well, 50 years, it seems about the right time to define what activities are authorized and what activities are prohibited. It came about because of Keller against State Bar of California. After the California Court of Appeals decided that the State Bar of California was in violation of the First Amendment, Washington State and I believe other jurisdictions thought, oh, we better get ahead of this. We better define what's authorized and what's not authorized so we don't do any of the unauthorized stuff, because that will subject us to First Amendment problems. So if a bar becomes voluntary, Keller becomes irrelevant. GR 12.2C, prohibited activities, doesn't matter anymore. So I imagine GR 12 would just go away. It would be stricken and reserved by the court. And then just finally, another interesting historical footnote, because GR 12 was enacted in 87, it was premature in a sense, because the US Supreme Court did not decide what we now know as the Keller case until 1990. And by getting out ahead of the United States Supreme Court, our GR 12.2C has been out of alignment with First Amendment jurisprudence for 35 years. No one ever went back and aligned GR 12 with Keller. So I guess I point that out as a cautionary tale. It's not always a great idea to get too far out ahead of what you're required to do.
Thank you for that historical perspective. And I suppose part of our organization was also a reaction, or a premature reaction, to somebody thinking that the North Carolina Dental Board case was going to have an impact on bar structures too. But we haven't had, I know the ABA used to write some articles about that. Governor Stevens is next.
Thank you, Mr. President. And as I listen to a number of the comments that are being made, at least for me, I'm placing them in a context. And that context really is expressing a number of ideas about where we might go, none of which is narrowing it down, which I think is fine. And I actually look forward to Director Platchy's work in terms of giving us kind of a menu of possible ways we can go, where some of the comments that are being made across the board will have, and I don't mean to use the word relevancy, but at least have a hook to some structure we might consider with some of the comments that are being made. Right now, I look at a number of these comments as just things we might do, things we should consider, et cetera. But I think once we have at least some proposals, or not proposals, options about what we do, we can set those options against some of the comments that are being made by my colleagues. So I'm enjoying the conversation, but for me right now, it's just conversation and not, and I would encourage my colleagues not to get too wrapped up in, well, this is what we ought to do, or this is what we ought to do, because at least for me, I need to hear that in terms of a structure or not. This is what we ought to do because we're going to do X, or this is what we ought to do because we're not going to do Y. So.
Thanks, Governor Stevens. Governor-elect Ferry, followed by Governor Couch.
I'm not muted. I just wanted to raise one thought here, President Tolleson. We are looking, or have been asked to look at changing the structure so that it complies, so that these activities can take place in compliance with 12.2 and other rules. A thought I have is change the rules. If you have the ability, if the section had the ability to, have WSBA section letterhead and send it into the legislature and have a little blurb on the bottom that says this is only the section speaking, not the WSBA as a whole. And we can Keller our way out of the support with the idea that the sections are supported. Perhaps that would work. And we wouldn't have to change the structure at all. That's just shuffling some pieces of paper.
Yeah, my screen is acting up. I don't know what's going on here. I'm going to have to reboot and get out. Yeah, Governor Couch was next.
Yes.
I was just going to go back, and I think, because the legislative power is something that is really interesting to me. And the Whistler example, I think, is good, but I think it's not the most helpful example, because what happened with Whistler versus the Washington State Association for Justice was that was part of a huge change that turned it into a lobbying powerhouse. The reason justice was chosen instead of trial lawyers is because they did focus groups that said that justice was a more welcoming word to people they were lobbying against. And so what happened, though, was the organization stayed the same. They changed their name, but nothing else was different. And I think splitting off the sections for legislative power to give legislative power to the sections is a different matter, because what you're saying is not, it's the same organization, but now they support this, but they're supporting this and they're able to. What you're saying is so many people that are part of this organization originally were opposed to this idea, or them being able to comment on this idea, that we've separated out into a separate entity that now exists. And that entity is smaller than the section was before, is most likely the case. And that smaller group of people that are no longer associated with the other thing because those people didn't want to talk about this, that group is what's saying something now. It is not the same message as having the Washington State Bar Association stand up for something. And I think it's important to have a state bar that does comment on things that are legislative, that affect lawyers and that matter to lawyers, that pass the GR 12.2 requirements, because there are things that affect all of lawyers that legislators do not consider. And it is powerful to be able to say the state bar, the organization that is mandatory for all lawyers, thinks this is important enough and germane enough that they believe a comment is necessary on this. That is a powerful statement that I'd hate to see lost.
Thank you, Governor Couch. We have Director Plachy, followed by Governor Boyd. And then maybe Council Shanklin would like to chime in too. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, President Tollefson. I have a comment, and it's probably to some of what Julie's going to talk about, but my thought on this is really not specifically about a GR 12 issue. The case law is about the constitutional issues, and the Constitution overrides GR 12. So I think to bring it back, and Julie will do this better than me, I'm sure. I just wanted to point out, I think it's the constitutional issue of freedom of association that's really in play here with these cases. It's not GR 12 necessarily.
Correct.
But then I'm interested more, and I'm interested because we're doing some work around these scenarios right now, is Governor Williams-Ruth, your scenario about a 501c3 that would be something like the foundation, but it's not really taking the sections and putting them into a 501c3. It's creating a 501c3 that's sort of got an objective of legislative lobbying kind of thing that any member could pay a fee into to belong to. And so to me, what you're, and I'm just trying to get this fleshed out in my mind, what you're talking about is an organization that's broader than the sections. It's any member that wants to be a part of it. And I would assume that legislative commenting out of anywhere from the organization wouldn't be considered germane would be going through that, not just the sections. Because it's a broader issue in my mind than the sections.
That's correct. That's, I mean, and it wouldn't actually be a C3 because that means it's a specific charitable nonprofit, but I think maybe C6 or one of the other 501Cs. But that's exactly it. I mean, there would be another entity where anyone, and whether the group from a specific section wanted to engage in commenting, and again, it would be, and I guess I don't believe that there would be any less power as long as it's very clear that we'd say WSBA does not comment on substantive areas of litigation or legislation. And so there's only a loss of power because of if the actual scenario came forward where it was the idea that less people didn't like this. It's not that, it's that we're trying to respect the fact, I mean, we have 90% of our association that's not involved. I mean, that's the bigger issue. I mean, maybe if we were at 80% involvement instead of 10%, and we actually did have a more handle on what our members wanted, that could be different. But right now, I struggle with every single vote that comes before the Board of Governors, where we have done somersaults and gymnastic routines that should get Olympic gold medals, trying to say that this is a GR12 analysis. And anyone who's served in this role that will say that we have done that. We have voted for things because we wanted it. But then there were others that came forward with ideas that we didn't necessarily like, and then they didn't get approval because it wasn't compliant. And that opens a whole other can of worms. I don't want to be the one sitting here judging whether something should be allowed to go forward or not. And that's where, again, having it's a different entity that handles those issues, that would have their own rules, that anyone who wants to, and again, they can create their own rules that say you must be a licensed member to participate, whatever they wanted to structure it. But it's not a bifurcation. It's taking one sliver of issues, giving it, and again, I'm calling it a safe harbor, creating that safe harbor entity where then people can engage in their own process, and then we would step out of it. We will encourage and send comments on court rules and mailing deadlines and rules for depositions and all the other things that specifically relate to here, but keep the sections and everything else and all of the powers, which I agree with. All of the other amazing things that the unified relationship has, but giving that one little place so people like me who want to be heavily politically involved can do so safely without running the risk that my words and my actions are going to then land us in court, and we're going to be, I mean, we have a huge self-insured retention for litigation. And that's not a good use of member money if we're having to pay for attorneys to represent the fact that I can't sit by and be quiet when all of these other horrible things are happening. We need a safe place to engage in it without being restricted by the GR12 rules.
I think Governor Boyd was up next.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? I had to switch to my phone. Okay. I have two thoughts. The first is, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think we've yet heard from a section that's asked us to spin them off. I think that by and large, all the sections have been saying that they want to stay a part of the WSBA. So I think that's something we definitely need to consider. But then my main comment was about this safe harbor idea, which I think is really interesting and intriguing. I'm just not sure that we're necessarily the right entity to create that. Treasurer Peterson's correct. Anybody could start a group that then lobbies, and presumably, if they get enough attorneys involved, they could have just as much power as the WSBA would have. I think practically it might be hard for individuals to start a group like that. So I wonder if maybe there's a place where we facilitate that discussion, but we're not creators of that safe harbor program. And then as soon as that program's been created, we, leave them to be a completely separate entity that's very different from us.
Anything else, Governor Boyd?
No, just throwing
Okay,
out solutions without any actual.
No, yeah, your
ideas.
hand's still up, but if you're on the phone, those things are awful hard to get down. I know.
I'm trying to put it down right now.
There
Thank
you
you.
go. I don't think I figured that out. Okay, Treasurer Peterson, are you in the queue? I think you are, followed by Governor-elect Ray, followed by, I thought I saw Governor Stevens. Maybe not. And I want to get Julie Shanklin in here, but I think she's probably appreciating getting all these comments ahead of time.
Yeah, no, thank you, President Tolson. And I do like, I do like Governor Williams' Ruth idea of, letting these people do something, whether, I don't, like he indicated, I'm not sure, it's not a 501c5, but whatever it would be, and encouraging them and letting them do that on their own. And I do think we could do that without changing anything structural wise. I guess the question, and thanks again to Chief Ende for his clarification. I guess I had a follow-up question just to make sure that really I'm understanding what you said. It sounded to me like if we bifurcated and the mandatory side was emissions and regulatory and stuff like that, and the sections and everything else was in a true voluntary bar, that GR 12 would not apply. So I guess the way I took your comments was that it could still be the Washington State Bar Association corporate counsel under a voluntary bar, and GR 12 would not apply. And so I guess that's my question, Chief Ende. Thank you.
Governor-elect Ray, followed by Councilor Shanklin. Oh, I think you're on mute. You're on mute. Hello. Turn on your mic.
I am sorry. Once again, I'm proving the height of my intelligence quotient. I agree with Governor Williams-Ruth that a safe harbor would be useful to some of our membership. 2 points on that. One, as I mentioned before, if you change the rules, a section could fulfill that because the sections are voluntary. You don't have to join one. The flip side of that, and actually the flip side of what Governor Williams-Ruth has brought up, is the First Amendment, particularly the freedom of association, and see what, depending on what traction Crouch gets, there are members who will vehemently disagree with whatever that group position would be, and they don't want to be associated with it. So if it's under the umbrella of the WSBA, which is mandatory, is it possible to have it both ways? I'm not sure a court could split that hair. And that's my comment. I'm sorry.
Thanks so much. Governor Stevens, you had your hand up at one point. Are you not? You're not weighing in at this point?
No, I just thought that more that I might say would just be adding to
Okay.
factory.
That brings us up to Council Shanklin, and I want to throw out something too. Now, I read, admittedly, it's been a while ago now, April 1st or whenever it was, but I read all those cases from that had those petitions for cert pending, and one of them was from Louisiana. And my understanding of the posture of that case is that even though the cert was denied, it's alive and well because in that case, whatever it was that the Fifth Circuit, whatever case Louisiana, Federal Circuit Louisiana is in, there were a couple of issues that didn't get dismissed out having to do with freedom of association. They were, again, the particular member of the Louisiana bar was upset about how the Bar Association was advocating for certain kinds of judicial selection procedures and was advocating for certain kinds of tort reform. And that's what he was upset about. And from what I understand, those claims have been sent back to the federal district court for further discovery. Is that what you remember?
So I think that might have been the Texas case instead of Louisiana. So that was one of the things I was going to talk about is, and I think we've talked about this before, in December, the Texas case that was sent back was settled, and the bar agreed to make certain changes to its operating procedures. And one of the things they did was to change kind of the scope of their legislative activities. And mind you, this is the Fifth Circuit. This is not the Ninth Circuit where we are. But based on that Fifth Circuit decision, they decided that their legislative and amicus activities would be limited to those that address the state bar itself, the regulation of lawyers, the functioning of state or federal courts, or the functioning of the legal system. And one of the other things that they decided, that they agreed, because it was an agreed resolution, was that the court's access to justice board, which is the way I understand it in Texas, it's kind of administered by the bar, like here, that access to justice is not called access to justice board, but their version of it also has to comply with these rules. And so, and that the bar is going to, going forward, review and approve all of their access to justice boards, legislative activity and speech. So I think that brings up an interesting point. Under our bylaws, the sections, it actually says the sections are entities of the bar. So, the sections are part of the bar. So although there is a section fee, the sections are part of the bar. So they are part of the association, and the association collects compelled fees. So, I think like even, this slightly further away access to justice entity in Texas, the sections, I think they're kind of stuck with our limitations. And Doug Endy is exactly right about GR 12. And I think we've talked about that before too. GR 12 was adopted by our court in 1987, 3 years before the US Supreme Court issued Keller. So the words of the limitations are not exactly the same. They're confusingly and annoyingly close, but they're not exactly the same. But I do think they're sort of both aimed at the same thing. If you look back in the minutes of the Board of Governors at the time, they're talking about what they call negative First Amendment rights. So I think it is kind of the same idea. But it's interesting to me, and I've said this before, that we just do a GR 12 analysis, because of course the First Amendment also applies. We can't just pretend like it doesn't. Asking, and it's interesting to me that we ask sections, for example, to do a GR 12 analysis. And it seems to me that what we're really saying to them is, make sure you're in the right lane. Go look at GR 12. Nobody ever looks at all the rest of the GR 12, right? the GR12, the limitation is small. It's very important, but it's small. But there's a lot of, all the purposes of the bar are also in GR12, and I don't know. So that's just, I think when we do a GR12 analysis, that's kind of a shorthand for saying, are we following GR12? But we also always have to consider Keller, right? We have to consider what those limitations are that are imposed by the First Amendment too. And something that I find interesting, and I'm just hoping that you will keep it in mind as you go through your conversations. So yes, the US Supreme Court did not take cert. We can talk some other time about what that means, because if you look at those cert petitions, in an interesting way, most of them wanted the US Supreme Court to go further than the circuit courts went, which I'm not gonna, you can all just interpret that the way you would like to. But if you read those cert petitions and you come to that same conclusion, that is an interesting thing to think about when you're thinking about whether the court took cert or not. But they didn't change any of those decisions. So all of the circuit court decisions that have come out recently still exist, right? So the idea that there is this separate cause of action potentially that's sort of between Lathrop and Keller for the freedom of association, absolutely disconnected from any money. That is sort of a newer idea. And then, Texas's idea, or the Fifth Circuit's idea, that Keller didn't really have a test, right? So here, I'm going to make one. That still exists too. The court didn't get rid of that. And then, yeah, I think there are 2 still live cases. Crow, I believe, is the last I knew anyway. It's still in discovery at the district court level. And I think they may have some kind of a deadline in May. I'm not absolutely certain. I know it's been extended a couple of times, and so it may actually be later than May now. But so GR12, applies to the WSBA, and the WSBA at this point in its life is an integrated bar, and was in 1987 when the rule was adopted. So to me, that sort of is clear that the GR12 as it exists today applies to the integrated bar WSBA. So I'm not sure I understood your question, Treasurer Peterson, exactly. But if WSBA were to change its structure and become a voluntary bar, then yes, I think Doug Ende is correct. There's no need for that rule to exist, because that rule is talking about things that can't be done with compelled fees. Oh, sorry, one more thing. In the Fifth Circuit case, they very clearly said that section speech is bar speech. And again, the court left that sitting there. And so I don't think that's surprising, but there is also now, at least in the Fifth Circuit, a court decision that says that.
Thank you very much for all of that. Governor Stevens.
So I appreciate following General Counsel, and I have a question for you, General Counsel Shanklin. And this gets back to the First Amendment issue and the association issue. And I'm just curious because, and my curiosity is, suppose a section or the Board of Governors takes an action that meets the test of GR12. But the objection is that, I don't know, maybe 50 of our members object to the direction we're going. and still, and that objection is, I don't want to be forced to have my money used in an effort or an activity that I disagree with. GR 12 notwithstanding. And my question is that still a live First Amendment compelled association issue that has to be dealt with?
Your turn, Council Shanklin.
So I think you're talking about Keller, and Keller's still good law. Did I misunderstand your question?
Well, I think you misunderstood my question just in the context of compelled association. So, because at least where, for example, if we look at Crow, my recollection is kind of like we do with the Keller deduction. They made an adjustment, and I think the adjustment was to rebate or send back to them $5. And the people who objected wanted a whole lot more than that, because they objected to the action or whatever had been done, and they took this view that they were harmed by having to have their money supporting, and maybe we haven't gotten there in terms of how much, et cetera, but as I recall Crow, the rebate of $5 did not in any way deal with the harm that those members felt, and they maintained their fight against the Bar Association. And I think they were looking at a far more significant portion of their mandatory dues being reduced.
Council Shanklin.
Ping pong. Right. So Crow was the first of the circuit court decisions to find that there is this cause of action for that violates the right of association that is not connected to the payment of the use of the fees. Right. And so that, I think, is what you're talking about. So yeah, in Oregon, rather than have a deduction, they say that they're Keller pure, and I don't mean to suggest that they're not Keller pure. But what they do is look at everything they do. This is my understanding. So if you're from Oregon and you think I have it wrong, please just tell me I have it wrong.
We'll probably hear from Shiketti on this. But.
They don't do anything that is not germane. But when this particular article was published, or these two articles were published, and members objected, yes, at that point they determined the cost of doing that, and they did give a deduction. And then the lawsuit, as you said, went further and said, yes, but we should not have to be a member of an organization that uses, or that does these things, that has among the activities that it is authorized to perform to take these political positions, period. Don't care, just period. We should not be required. It violates our First Amendment right of freedom of association to be required to join this association that has that one of the functions of them, or one of their purposes, is to take these political positions that we disagree with. And so I guess partly what you're saying is it's a different remedy. Right? So Keller is a remedy for speech, but Keller doesn't deal with the association issue. And that's where Crow was the first of several circuits. And all those decisions, well, the Crow decision is now, back at district court, but the Fifth Circuit, there are two decisions in Fifth Circuit that agreed with Crow that this freedom of association is an issue to be considered. And that will be, I'm assuming, coming back up from the district court and going somewhere in the future.
And I don't want to, again, beat this horse to glue, but I'm looking at both you and Kevin, at least in terms of, we're talking about structure, but when it comes to this, I'd say vaguely defined, if defined at all, concept of germaneness. And I hate to ask this question, but I'm going to do it anyway. Will we need to, well, I'm going to ask you if at least some of your recommendations might also include a list of those activities. So even though we do this, you know, we may do some work around GR 12.2C. Is there another door that we have to deal with, which is what is germane and what is not germane? Who gets to decide? And if people disagree, what then?
Council Shanklin, and my answer is who gets to decide is who has the last word, usually the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Council
But right now,
Shanklin
we don't have
can
much.
correct me if I'm wrong.
So I did not reread all the decisions this morning. I believe it's actually in the Fifth Circuit decision where it points out in some of its analysis, absolute agreement of all the members is not what's required. That's not what the standard is. And so, you know, we, as you know, think about that because that's how you figure out whether people are going to sue you or not, I suppose, right? That you're just engaging in the same risk analysis that you would engage in before you did any activity, I suppose, hopefully. But you know, the standards really are, yes, you're right. So the Keller test is very fuzzy, and that is in fact what the court talked about in Janus. How the heck are you even supposed to know how to do this test? And it's one of the things that all of us have been thinking about, because the Fifth Circuit sort of went pretty far down the road and set a state bar that engages in any non-germane activity is unconstitutional. And so, you know, if really where we're sitting or could be sitting is trying to figure out, you know, is it really true that if we go through that fuzzy analysis and make one mistake that our structure is unconstitutional? If that is in fact where we're sitting, that's a difficult place, right, for integrated bars to be. Not suggesting that that's where we are sitting, but that is a potential way to read all these cases together. And I think that's why at least some people were hoping the US Supreme Court would answer the question, and they didn't. But yes, the Keller test is hard, figuring out exactly with any given set of actual facts, what is germane and what is not germane is hard. In our circumstances, I think we struggle with it a lot because the words of GR 12.2C2, I think it's C2, are not exactly the same as the words in Keller. And so that seems to cause even more confusion for us. So any clarity that we can provide around what is germane, what is not germane would be helpful. And that's why I also think the sort of the corollary is then if you decide that the test is fuzzy and the risk is high, then I think that's how you get to all of these other options. You know, at some point, the work that might be risky is so important to be done that you might consider doing it in some other way to protect the work and make sure it can be ongoing. But then you have to figure out, I guess, you know, are the legal risks worth the, whatever you call them, the structural risks or whatever it is that you lose by separating pieces of work from each other. And, you know, I don't think this is just all about the sections. I've said that before. This is about expressive activity. And the sections engage in some of that. There's all kinds of other expressive activity that the bar also does. And I don't know if you were to decide to take one of these other options, whether you would put all of the expressive activities that might end up being one of these non-germane things in this other entity or not.
I'll let it go for now.
We have Director Platchy up next, and I think it's important to make sure that I don't know if we've gotten anybody from our different, well, we have members of our different bar association committees on this call today, and that's why I was kind of opening it up to make sure that if we had people in different committees that wanted to speak up, they would speak up, because we're hitting the 2 o'clock hour. We're supposed to take a break, but before we take that break, I want Director Platchy to share with us what he wants to share, and then I think we'll take our afternoon break and then get back on schedule.
Thank you, President Tollefson. The only thing I'll add to what Julie had said is around the scenario modeling that we're doing, and this kind of gets to some of your, a little bit of your question too, Governor Stevens, is we're just sort of making some broad assumptions with these models we're doing. So we don't know exactly what, you know, if the board was leaning towards one scenario or the other, what the particulars of that would look like until the board decides. So there's some broad assumptions that we're making with these models, like with the California model that, you know, sections would lift out, probably CLE would lift out, and we're modeling to see what fiscal impact that would have. But by no means do we know exactly what you as the policy setters would want done if we actually started going down that route. So the modeling we're doing is is making some very broad assumptions. It's going to be very, it's not going to be real specific because we don't know all the assumptions we're working with. And as to sort of, I guess, who decides, in my mind, I think because this is not being, if you're looking at what is the best model, this isn't driven by a court decision. It's driven by what operationally and mission oriented and all of that kind of thing is the best solution for this organization, would be by and large determined by the board. And so I just want to flag that, because when we bring these models to the next meeting, it's just really important that I hope everyone understands these are not exact models. They're estimates. They're based on some just major assumptions we're making that we don't even know will become actual. If the option was chosen, we don't even know if they would become actuality, because we don't know what decisions would be made down to some very fine points. So I just wanted to just reiterate that, because these models and scenarios are just that, nothing more.
Mr. President.
I was going to take your comment before we took our break, obviously, Governor Stevens.
Thank you. And Director Platchy, I say this greatly tongue in cheek, but that what you just shared with me sounded like a preemptive plea not to shoot the messenger when they come back with their ideas. And that's okay.
Okay. We were scheduled to take a break at 2 o'clock. It's a little after 2 o'clock. And then we're supposed to resume at 2:45, right? That's what. So shall we take a little bit shorter break? Yeah. So why don't we come back in about 15 minutes? That would be what, 222? Make it 225 rounding up. Let's do that. Let's take a break and come back at 225.